Great. I'm really excited to be talking with you all today. My name's Amanda Brodish, and I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Data Analytics in the Office of the Provost at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm joined today by my colleague, April Belbeck, who is the Director of Student Success in the Office of the Provost, also here at Pitt. And today we're going to be presenting on Student Success Assessment 101. And just as a little background for this talk, April asked me to deliver a version of this talk to staff and research practitioners at Pitt earlier this year to help folks at Pitt interested in doing student success work really think about student success from an institutional research and a reporting perspective. And as a person who loves data and talking about data and loves working with April, I was happy to put this talk together. And in putting the talk together, I drew on my 10 years of experience working on reporting and analytics from an institutional research perspective. At Pitt, I oversee our official external reporting to the state, to the federal organizations, as well as to various ranking organizations like US News and World Report. So I'm really in the weeds with how we report and handle data. But for the past 5 years, I've worked on our student success and advising platform. And in that role, I've really started to think about student success from a more student-centric perspective. And I've been able to leverage what I learned about reporting and analytics to think about the best way to assess student success initiatives in ways that align with reporting requirements. And so that's really the kind of the genesis of this presentation. And so with that, I'll dig in. And as Alexa mentioned, I'm quite happy for you all to ask questions, come off chat and ask questions, put things in the chat. Any way you want to ask a question is fine with me, and I'll stop at various points to take stock of any questions that have come in so far. So in terms of the goals for today's talk, the first is to understand the undergraduate student life cycle and population. The next is for you to understand the metrics that we report internally and externally. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a detour to talk about Pitt's process for granting access to administrative data. I think it's important to share that because it's an important piece in this story. And then lastly, I'll talk about how to identify metrics that are appropriate for your research question. And here we'll do a little bit of more collaborative work. We'll go into some breakout rooms and talk through some examples. Okay. So when we think about the student life cycle and population, I'll be talking about 3 areas here. The admissions funnel. For those of you who work out of admissions and financial aid, this is going to be very familiar to you, but I'll still review that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the student population, and then I'll go on and talk about something called the official cohort. That's very important for reporting purposes. So when we think about the higher education admissions funnel, it starts with our largest number of students or prospective students, and we narrow down to a smaller set of students who enroll on our campus at our official, what's called a census date. And so I'll walk through these different layers. At the highest level of the admissions funnel are what are called inquiries. These are students, potential students who you think might be interested in applying for admission at your college or university. When a student applies to your college or university, they become an applicant. At the University of Pittsburgh, our application opens on August 1st, probably similar dates for many other colleges and universities. We then come down to our admitted students. These are the students who we accept for admission to the University of Pittsburgh, and we operate on a rolling admission basis. So as students are applying for admission, we are accepting them for admission. Then we have our students who pay a deposit and tell us, I want to come, you want me, I want you. They give us a small financial deposit. The date for that is May 1, as it is at most colleges and universities. But not all the students who pay a deposit to us actually show up and are enrolled at the university on our official student census of September 28th. And I'll unpack 2 pieces there. Those of you are probably familiar with the term of summer melts. And that's the melting off of students who paid a deposit by May 1st, who don't show up on our campus on September 28th. There's a lot of work in trying to prevent summer melt from happening. That's an area where we work and lots of colleges and universities work. So that's that summer melt, is that change from our deposited students to our enrolled students. And the other thing I want to mention here is that student census. For folks who maybe don't work in an institutional research capacity, you may say, what's a student census? What is that? Well, every fall, all colleges and universities will take a census of their students. And each college and university is free to set their own census date. At the University of Pittsburgh, our census date is September 28th. Many colleges and universities have a census date, somewhere between September 10th to September 30th. And if you ask the IR person at your college, they will be able to spit that date off the top of their head because it is so important. And the reason I'm talking about this admissions funnel is because it feeds into our student population. And at the University of Pittsburgh, the most recent fall census, we had just about 20,000 undergraduate students enrolled on our campus. And this 20,000 students is made up of subpopulations of students. And the students who applied for admission, were accepted, paid a deposit, and were enrolled at this most recent fall 2022, they were our fall 2022 cohort. They made up about 4,400 of our students. But this is just one subpopulation of our students. As you can imagine, we have students who came in as part of the other cohorts, which I'll unpack in just a second. So we have those students from the other cohorts. They're smaller numbers because we lose them through attrition. Students aren't coming back, or they're graduating as we get to some of our later cohorts. Our population is also made up of students from some earlier cohorts, even earlier than that, who may be coming back to finish their degree. Our population is also made up of external transfers, students coming in from other colleges and universities, as well as internal transfers from our regional campuses. We have 4 regional campuses at the University of Pittsburgh. And then we have students who are coming in from other venues or are continuing at that point. So we can think about our population as being made up of these various subpopulations. Any questions about that? Okay, well, let me dig in to talk about this official cohort. I mentioned that a couple times here, and this is important to define and understand. So our official cohort are our students who've come in as first-time first-year students. So these are students who are coming directly from high school to college, are part of this cohort. Our cohort are students who are enrolled full-time at our student census date of September 28th. So if a student was enrolled for 15 credits on September 27th, and on September 28th, they dropped down below 12 credits, they would now not be part of our full-time cohort because they're enrolled part-time at that census date. Students also for our cohort need to be enrolled in some sort of degree program. At the University of Pittsburgh, that's our bachelor's degree program. For community colleges, that might be an associate's degree program. At the University of Pittsburgh, we finalized this cohort at the end of the term, at the beginning of January, so that we can exclude what we call retroactive withdrawals. These are students who paid a deposit, they met with their advisor, they enrolled in classes, they might have even had a dorm on campus. But at the end of the term, we realized that student never stepped foot on campus. And so we want to exclude that student from our cohort. And then this group of students is the full-time, first-time, first-year degree-seeking students. That's a mouthful, so we call it the official cohort. And this is a group that your institutional research folks are tracking for a variety of reasons, which I'll unpack on the next slide. So whenever you're working with them, if you can talk about this cohort of students, that's going to help you have that kind of same language that they're using. And the reason that this cohort matters is because we use this cohort in government-related reporting. All colleges and universities that accept federal financial aid have to report information about themselves to the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, or IPEDS. And IPEDS tracks information about students in that cohort, tracks retention, graduation rates. We also use the cohort in any ranking related reporting. When we report to US News and World Report and they're asking about the size of our first year class, it's the cohort that we're giving to them. If they're talking about retention and graduation rates, or retention rates for Pell students versus non-Pell students, that's the cohort that they're looking at. We also at the university use this cohort for our own internal reporting. When we do annual planning reports, when we're doing our external diversity dashboards, anything that we're doing that's kind of at the pit level, we're really focusing on that cohort. So it's very important to know how that's defined, why it's important, and what we track of that cohort. And I'll be unpacking that in the next few slides. People often ask, can students be removed from the cohort? And the answer is yes, but only due to a very small, limited number of reasons. Death, permanent disability, and military or religious service. So that student who had a mental health crisis and had to withdraw after September 28th is going to continue to be part of that cohort, whereas a student who maybe suffered a injury and has a permanent disability, they could be removed from that cohort. So the IPEDS, the federal agency we report to, is very particular about exclusions from that cohort, but they can happen. So I want to turn next to some key metrics across time, but I'll just pause and see if there are any questions that have come into chat, or if anyone wants to ask a question. Okay, so as we think about key metrics, it can be useful to think about them mapped along a student's experience at the university. And here, what I've thought about was a student who matriculates to the university and is here 8 terms and managed to graduate in their spring term. This doesn't reflect many student experiences, but it's a little bit easier to think about what I'm going to talk about in terms of metrics for the student who's following this particular pattern. And there are some metrics that we collect at that fall census date. So for any given student, we're going to be collecting that metric for them at 4 different points in time. There are other metrics that become available at the end of each term. So we're going to have these metrics at 8 different time points for this particular exemplar student. And then there are metrics that we collect when a student graduates from the university. And so I think it's useful to think about this in mind as you think about which metrics you might be interested in for your student success assessment. And so I'm going to focus on each of these 3 types of metrics on the next few slides. So we'll be starting about those available at that fall census date. So at the fall census date, we know information about our newly admitted students who are coming to the university for the first time related to admissions. And when I'm talking about admissions data, I'm talking here about things like test scores and class rank and high school GPA. So this is information we know about students at that fall census date. Test scores like the SAT and the ACT score are no longer required for admission at Pitt. I know we are not alone. Many colleges and universities are going this route. And so we only have this information on about half of the students at our university now. And so we've essentially stopped using SAT scores or ACT scores to get some sort of indicator of a student's preparation when they come to the university, because we only have it on 50% of our students. We know the students who take and submit SAT scores are different from those who opt not to take and submit SAT scores. So using that would bias our analyses. So we have essentially stopped using that. Class rank is also provided by only about 1/3 of our students. So we don't use that metric very much anymore either. High school GPA is submitted by almost all of our students. So this is the metric that we're often using in our analyses, but it's imperfect. Not all high schools use the same GPA scale. Many international students don't have a high school GPA that's included as part of their application. So it can be a little bit tricky. And I mention this because you may be saying, I want to have a way to control for the academic preparation of students coming into my college or university. And the natural thought is to say, oh, SAT scores would be very good. But if your college or university is no longer using them for admission, they're not going to be a metric that you can use. And you'll have to think about some other metrics that you might be able to leverage. Another metric that's important at the fall census are some various demographic variables. And I'll highlight a few on the next slide. So the first one is sex and gender. So the federal government, IPEDS, dictates when we report things to them. They want things male and female. That's the way we have to report to the federal government. But internally, we have much more nuanced gender identity data that we track internally and that you may be able to get from your institution if they are also tracking this information in a more nuanced way. But it's important to keep in mind that the way data will be reported externally is going to use that male-female, those two options. Another metric that we have, a demographic metric, is race ethnicity. Again, the federal government dictates one category per student, but your institution, like Pitt, might have more nuanced data available internally. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by it dictates one category per student, a student who's indicated to us that they identify as, say, Black and Asian would get reported to the federal government as multiracial. But perhaps in your analysis, you want to reflect that they are both Black and Asian. And so you might want that more nuanced data, and you could work with your folks who you're getting data to be able to get some of that more nuanced data.
Amanda, can I stop you for a really good question from the audience?
Yep.
So folks are asking, like, where do we collect this more nuanced data?
Yeah, so we've worked with folks from across the university to collect more nuanced data. And on our institution, the data flows from at the time of admission into our student information system, or SIS system. And so in order to get this more nuanced data, it really becomes a collaboration between the folks in your Office of Admissions and Financial Aid, as well as your folks who are running your student information system, along with the folks in your IT department who may be doing those integrations. And so it's really bringing together all of those people in order to make that happen. Does that answer the question? Or I'm happy to talk more about that.
Absolutely. And I think another opportunity is also the intake survey, right? Because advisors also need an opportunity to have this conversation with students and also allow students to update. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Another way that we at the University of Pittsburgh are gathering this information on our students is through an intake survey that all of our new students are asked to complete. And because we make it as part of the initial advising conversation, they need to complete this survey to meet with an advisor, we're able to get just about 100% response rate. And so students are asked a host of questions, but among those questions are some different demographics that we would want to know about the students, like, for example, the pronouns that they would prefer that they want folks to use when they talk to them. So we're getting that information through the intake survey. One important distinction that I'll make here is that when the information flows from the student application into the student information system, that becomes a shared source of data that everyone at the university has access to. So your institutional research people would have access to that. Folks embedded within your school or college would have access to that. In contrast, information that you may be collecting from an intake survey may only be available to a more limited group of people. Depending on who you want to have access to the information and what you plan to do with it, you might want to take one or the other approach. Related to that, it's important that multiple people not be asking the student the same question. because that can also be a problem from a student perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, there's also another question in the chat in regards to what metrics fall under permanent disability, physical, and mental.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the way the guidance is written that we get from IPEDS, the Department of Education, it is, I think a mental disability might fall under that, but I think they're really talking about a physical disability that would prevent someone from being able to re-enroll at the university. Those are guidelines that I might be able to get some more specifics on through the IPEDS website. I think that's kind of the best answer I can offer right now. Thanks for calling that out, Alexa. Okay. So a few other demographic variables that I want to mention here that I think are particularly important are first generation status. So is a student the first in their family to enroll in college? And we have this metric on all of our students, and it comes from a combination of sources. That question is asked at the time of application, and it's also asked on the FAFSA. And so for students who are completing the FAFSA, we're getting it from their FAFSA. From students who haven't completed a FAFSA, we're getting that information from the application. Again, this requires some of that conversation between your admissions people, your student information system people, and your IT people to make those integrations work. But when they do, it's great because everyone has access to that information. Another demographic variable that is important is the student's Pell status. Are they receiving or are they eligible for a Pell Grant? And I'll just offer one nuance here with respect to Pell status. We know immediately if a student is Pell eligible when they've completed the FAFSA, but we don't necessarily know that the student has received the Pell Grant until the end of the year, because a student could get a Pell Grant at any time during the academic year and would count as being a Pell recipient for that particular year. So it's just important to know that there is this difference between being eligible for a Pell Grant versus actually receiving a Pell Grant. And so most students who are eligible for a Pell Grant get it, but not all. So an example is that there is a limited number of terms in which a student can receive a Pell Grant. And so a student could be eligible based on income and family size, but perhaps they've already received their Pell Grant for the maximum number of terms that they could receive it. So that would be an example of a student who was eligible for a Pell Grant, but didn't receive that Pell Grant. So just know that those two things are different.
Amanda, another question has come through.
Yeah.
Specifically about first gen. Can you talk about, first gen status? So somebody asked, so first gen is technically first gen to enroll, not complete college. So does it specify 4-year or 2-year? So maybe talk about how we've defined first gen at Pitt.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think the question that we use to get to our first generation flags. And April, you might actually know a little bit better than I might. Are you remembering off the top of your head?
Yeah, so we define it pretty simply that the student does not have a parent who has completed a bachelor's degree, right? So our definition is pretty simple. Other colleges and schools have a little bit more nuanced degree, et cetera. But we keep it pretty simple. A student does not have a parent who has completed a bachelor's degree. So that's about as simple as it can be, right? And so to answer your question, Erica, that's correct. Is there a federal norm for No, there's not. Not really. There's lots of different definitions out there other than a TRIO definition, which ours pretty much aligns with.
Thanks, April.
Absolutely.
Okay. The next two sets of metrics I want to talk about are really important ones in the student success space. And there are first year to second year retention and our 4- and 6-year graduation rates. And these are really important metrics that before I came into higher education, I didn't realize how important they were. But now, I know that they are very important. These are the things that we are submitting to federal government. If we have performance-based funding from our state, these are the kinds of metrics that we may be evaluated on. So these are very important. And so it's important to understand them and how they're calculated. Retention and graduation rates are tracked by incoming cohort year. What I mean is, for the fall of 2022 cohort, those are the students who came in this past year, we'll be tracking over the next 6 years what's happening for that cohort. So when we hit the fall census date of September 28, 2023, we will be able to come up with a retention rate for that cohort. And when those students have had 4 years to graduate, we will come up with a cohort with a 4-year graduation rate for the fall of 2022 cohort. When we get to the 6th year, they'll have had 6 years to graduate. Okay, so it's tracked by incoming cohort year. And any disaggregation or subgroups of those retention and graduation rates are based on the standing on that subgroup in the first year. And so just to give you a really clear example of what this looks like and what I mean here is that one of the metrics that we report to iPads as well as to US News and World Report is the 6-year graduation rates for our Pell recipient students. So we have a 6-year graduation rate for Pell students, a 6-year graduation rate for non-Pell students. What that means is it's about, did the student get a Pell grant at any point during their first year? That defines whether they are in the Pell cohort or the not Pell cohort. So a student could have received a Pell grant just their first year, never again. They are still part of the Pell group. If they didn't receive a Pell grant their first year, but received it all the other years they were here, they would still be in the not Pell group, okay? Because these cohorts get frozen essentially at the beginning of the student's career at the college or university. And as we think about retention success, so how do we determine that someone's been retained on our university? It's typically just, was the student enrolled either full-time or part-time on whatever your university census date is? Okay, so a student could be enrolled for 3 credits on September 28th at the University of Pittsburgh, and they would be considered retained. Graduation success is defined as having a degree by the August 31st of a given year. And that will tell us if the student got a degree for that particular year. So just some nuances that I think are important to keep in mind in understanding retention and graduation rates. So what I want to turn to next is talking about some metrics that are available at the end of the term. And here we're talking about some much more simple metrics. We're talking about things like the term GPA or cumulative GPA at that point in the student's career. This could be the number of credits that a student completed in a given term, or the percent of the credits that were completed over the percent attempted. So that might be another example of a metric. Obviously, the grade that a student received in a course would be an important metric. And sometimes when we're doing our analyses, we might look at a more crude metric that says, did the student get a D or an F or withdraw from a particular course? And that becomes a metric that we can look at the end of the term. As we turn to metrics at graduation, we can look at things like the major or minor, certificate, or different credentials that a student might have at the time they graduated. We can look at the amount of time it took them to graduate, so that's time to degree. That metric is different than their retention rate, or did they graduate within 4 or 5 or 6 years? Because the time to degree metric looks at when a student got their degree and essentially counts back to when they started. So it's a little bit of a different way to think about that. Student debt at graduation is another important metric that we track at the University of Pittsburgh. And another important one is post-graduation outcome or placement. So did the student get a job? Did the student is the student going on to graduate school? So these are some important metrics that we track at the time of graduation. April, any other questions come into chat that I should call out? Okay.
I think we're doing good.
Okay. I'm gonna kind of hand wave at another set of metrics that we track at the university. I'm really focused on sort of administrative metrics, administrative student metrics, but I want to also mention some survey data that we collect at the university. And so every year we do some satisfaction surveys of our students. At the time students graduate, we collect some graduation surveys for our students. And we also collect survey data on our alumni. And some folks are able to marry together these different data sources. So to combine some satisfaction survey data with some of the metric data that I already outlined to really get a nice picture of what's happening for a student. So I'm not going to go into too much depth about the survey data, except to say that we do survey our students, and that becomes another metric that can be tracked.
Okay, so we do have some questions now.
Okay.
All right, so for student debt, if we could go back to that, for student debt at graduation, are you looking at all debt like private loans, et cetera, or just federal state aid related debt? Great question.
Yeah, great question. So we have, at our university, we can look at both of those things. I believe when we're reporting to some different organizations, they do want us to restrict to like federal and state debt and not include private debt. But we do also roll private debt into that and can track that as well. So it's sort of a little from column A and a little from column B. We feel like we get the best indicator of what a student's debt load is if we have all of it, rather than just a portion of it. Now, there may be some debt that we're not able to capture if it's not specifically called out as student loan debt. So, obviously, if a student is taking debt out on credit card for other things, we're not going to have that. But for other sources of private loans, I would suggest including them in addition to those federal and state.
But what about Parent Plus?
Parent Plus loans. So again, I think the reporting requirements dictate whether that gets included or not. Again, I will say it can be one of those things where we include it as part of the analysis, and perhaps in another, we might not include it. We certainly have that information. I would say it's a matter of having that conversation with whoever is pulling the data with you to make sure what they're pulling is matching your expectations. And going in with that kind of question, like I want Parent Plus loans, so that they know you want that information is important.
And then what about things like cumulative GPA? Is that at graduation, right? Cum GPA at graduation, is that one of the metrics?
Yeah, we certainly can. That would be a metric that would be available at graduation, and also, the last term their cumulative GPA would be their cumulative GPA at graduation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we can look at that can be kind of interesting is how a student's cumulative GPA tracks over time, as they're, are they tracking upward or are they tracking downward in terms of that cumulative GPA is an interesting metric.
Absolutely. Okay, then there's a question, and I think a couple of people are interested in this about the surveys, right?
Yeah.
So can you speak to the type of qualitative data we capture in the satisfaction survey or other qualitative surveys that we look at?
Yeah. So most of the survey data that we do within the Office of the Provost is more quantitative in nature, though we do offer students the opportunity to provide some open-ended data to us. When we're getting data from 10,000 students, it can be a bit of a challenge to really dig into those qualitative data. But I will talk about one data we administer that relies almost exclusively on qualitative kind of interview techniques. And that's a survey we do of our students who leave the university. It's aptly named our Leavers Survey. And it is a phone survey that's conducted where we identify all the students who haven't re-enrolled at the university. And we have a set of folks who are trained in phone interview techniques who call these students and have a conversation with them about why they didn't come back. And that's been a really rich, interesting source of data to understand why students aren't coming back to the university. And this is a survey that we've been doing over the past, it's been 25 years that we've done that. And it's provided a lot of rich information that we would not be able to get in the quantitative assessments.
And then I totally agree, by the way, and we've been able to present it to some other folks as well and kind of scale some of that information.
Yeah.
So what about poor response rates, Amanda, to surveys? How do we address that?
I wish we could do better, and I have some ideas about ways that we could address it. When we look at our survey response rates over the past 10 years that I've been at the university, they have plummeted. And I think there are a multitude of reasons for that, including over surveying of students and just students getting tons of email and them not knowing what to do. We're working in a number of capacities to try to help centralize some of the surveys that are happening at our university so that students aren't asked the same question by the provost's office, their school, and their department, that maybe we can ask it once and share the data out with all of those people. So we have some ideas for how we're working with response rates. In addition, we've put together a survey calendar for folks who are surveying students so that they are able to see when other people are surveying students to say, well, that might be a time I want to avoid. We've also attempted to develop some best practices in survey administration that we're sharing with our different folks who are doing a lot of surveying. So we're trying to do a lot of things, but I'm not sure we're particularly effective in dealing with those low response rates.
So I think I'm going to let you go ahead because I think these two questions might be some things we're going to talk about, if that's okay, Tammy and Tammy. But if we don't get to them, we'll come back to your questions.
Okay, great. So what I want to turn to right now is a process that we developed at the University of Pittsburgh to facilitate folks accessing data at the university. And this came from a need that I experienced where I had people reaching out to me saying, how do I get access to administrative student data? Or they would contact me, they would contact a colleague in the registrar's office. And we wanted to give them the data, but we just didn't feel like we had a way to do it. We didn't have a process. And so we developed this process to facilitate folks accessing student data for quality improvement research and or for scholarly research. And to do this, we formed a work group to really develop and flesh out this process. And because this was a question and a concern that cut across multiple units at the university, we brought together people from our IT department with people from our registrar's office who handled our student information system. We talked with folks from our institutional research board, our human subjects folks to have them weigh in. We had folks from the provost's office, and we also had folks in legal and compliance. And we came together and we fleshed out a process. We said, what should this look like? Who should be approving these things? How should this process work? We developed a data request form and a website so that folks in our university community could go to this website and they could complete a form to request access to data. And we developed a data use agreement. When we shared data with people, they had to agree to a small set of requirements that we had for how they were going to handle the data. And then we also developed a process for students to opt out of having their data shared, a separate process from FERPA, because the data we were sharing was de-identified student data, which is not included, not covered under FERPA. And so we wanted to give students the option to say, hey, I don't want you to share my data. So we developed that process as well. And we rolled out, oh, actually, before I do that, I'm going to walk through our flow chart for thinking about getting access to data for researchers. And I'll also say I've shared this information with staff at the university and researchers so that they understand what to do when they're thinking about embarking on a project. And so the way I encourage people to think about this is to say, is my project a quality improvement project, or is it a scholarly research project? And if someone's like, how do I know if my project is a scholarly research project? The way I think about it is, do you want to generalize your findings outside of the group you're working on? And if you want to generalize those findings, then I would put that in the bucket of scholarly research. If you're interested in making quality improvements within your sort of micro system, then I would put it as a quality improvement project. And we take sort of different paths depending what type of research or what type of project you're embarking on. If it's a quality improvement project, I would, the first question is, do you have access to the data you need? Do you have what you need to do that project? And if the answer is yes, just go and do it. You don't need to ask permission. You're engaging in quality research. Maybe this is program assessment work. If you have the data and you want to do the analysis on it, go for it. If for some reason you don't have the data, that's when you complete this data request form. If your project is approved, my team facilitates you getting that data, the data that you requested. This may involve us collaborating with other folks on campus, or even handing you off to someone else and saying, this project has been approved by the Office of the Provost Data Request. These are the elements that this researcher, or in this case, it would be like a program administrator, needs, so get them what they need. So we're either directly providing the data or we're facilitating it. If you're rejected, we say, sorry, try again. If you've determined that your project is a scholarly research project, you first need to apply for the IRB approval through our Human Subjects Office. If your study is rejected, again, sorry. If it's approved, that's when you complete the OTP data request form and continue through the flow chart here. Now, what I typically advise people to do is I say, if you're interested in doing scholarly research, have a quick conversation with me or someone on my team before you go ahead and apply for that IRB approval. We're going to be able to tell you, oh yeah, that's a project that's going to be approved, or this is how you should talk about the data in your IRB approval. What we don't want to have happen is someone go to our IRB, lay out a project, get it approved, and then it comes to us and we say, oh no, we're not going to, we can't give you those data. We don't want that to happen. So we try to have this be as collaborative a process as possible. And we launched this process in 2021, and we formally completed 9 requests, which isn't a lot, but I would say we've informally facilitated 5 to 10 of these requests. But most importantly, we've created a transparent process and a culture for faculty and administrators to access their data. There's no more question about where do I go if I want data. They know where to come. They know what the process is. They know we're going to help them navigate the situation so that they're able to get the data they need to do their quality improvement project or to do their scholarly research. So we've been very excited about this process and the transparency that it's created. Okay, so I'm going to head into the last part of the talk. If there aren't any questions, I'll pause for a second to take some questions.
So I think overall, there are some questions about, can you speak about how we use all of these data points to determine overall success, as well as all of the demographics that you talked about and different qualities? So like, what does OTP look at? And what are kind of some of the reports that we use for leadership? You know, and thinking about student success at our university, I guess, is the big question, right?
Yeah, sure. So we try to synthesize a lot of this information for our leaders so that they're not having to dig through tons of reports to find what they need. And really, when we're talking to our leaders, the things that are most important to them are that first to second year retention rate and our 4-year and 6-year graduation rates. So my team has developed dashboards to make it really easy for people on a historical basis to say, what are the trends in these metrics? What do our retention rates look like for our Pell students versus our non-Pell students, our Black students versus our white students? And that those kind of historical metrics are shared with various leaders across the university who can help use that information to guide policy and decision-making. But there are other ways where we try to get this information to folks sort of out in front, the people who are on the front lines who can actually do stuff to try to help students. And so we have some things that we've done in that spirit. And so one of the things that we've done is to provide real-time information about which of our students living in our first year residence halls are retained to the next fall term. And we're sharing that information with our partners in residence life so that they can literally knock on doors of students and try to see what's going on. And so that's a way where we're trying to take the data that we have and actually impact change with students rather than looking back at what's happened in the past to develop programming. Both of those things are important, but I think they address different needs and require different set of data to be able to speak to those questions. April, is there anything else that you would want to add from your vantage point?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think also this presentation, like Amanda started with saying, like, April asked me to give this and the reason is because what we hear from researchers, from practitioners across the institution is people talking about student success and student success assessment terms in a big R1 institution, but I bet it's happening at your institution too, no matter how big or how small, right? They talk about all of these different things in different ways. So we wanted to start, like, how does OTP, Office of the Provost, that's what we call it, how does the Office of the Provost define these things from an institutional level, right? And we wanted to start talking about it all the same thing, all the same. You say retention, what do we mean by that, right? We say first year students, not freshmen. You know what I mean? It's like now we're going to all start talking about it the same way. And so to answer Tammy's question, what kind of data do you collect from student support programs across the campus? Well, I'll give you an example of that in a moment, but really we just started doing that because we felt like doing this first, right, is like step number one, because we can't like collect those things if we weren't all talking about it the same way. Yeah. We just started doing that too. And I think I'll give you an example in one moment, but Amanda's going to show you how we do it or what we ask, right? But Amanda's team does a lot better job, so.
And also, Annabelle asked in the chat, any predictive modeling and what data do you utilize? We do have some student success predictive modeling that we've worked with a vendor to develop. For an institution that has a 94% retention rate, we found that our predictive modeling it's not all that useful in our particular context because our advisors have a pretty good sense of which of their students are not going to be coming back, or at least are going to be struggling. So in our context, we haven't found that predictive modeling quite as useful, but we do have it. We are leveraging in our predictive models things that are in our student information system. So we're not doing what I know some institutions have done where they're utilizing card swipe data from students. Are they, when are they swiping in and out of their dorms? When are they eating? When are they going to the wellness center? We very strategically made the decision that we were not going to ingest those data into our predictive models. For a variety of reasons that I won't go into here, but we very strategically made that particular decision. But it is certainly a space where we have played around and done some work. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about identifying metrics for your research. And so when someone comes to me and wants data to answer a question, these questions here are what I use to guide the conversation. And the first is really asking, what's the purpose of your research, or what are the objectives of your research program? What are you trying to do at a very broad level? And then it's coming down to say, well, who's your population? Who are you working with? You need to define that very clearly for your institutional research or assessment people. We like definitions. And if you're not sure what the definition is, just talking. And from that talk, we're able to come up with a definition. And then importantly, you need to think about, what's your control group? How are you going to know if your program is having an impact? And so you really need to be thinking about that control group. In some contexts, you might be able to do a true like A/B experiment where you're doing something with one group of students and not doing with another group of students. You may be able to do that. And an example I'll describe in a second, we weren't able to do that. So we had to think about other ways to come up with that control group. And then you need to come up with the outcome, define that outcome. That it's about operationalizing the purpose of the research to come up with that outcome. And then an important piece of this puzzle is thinking about how long you can wait for results. You may be interested in 6-year graduation rates, but boy, you're going to have to wait 6 years to have an answer to your question. So what are some metrics you can build in to look at as your program is unfolding to see its efficacy? And so to put this into practice, I'm going to walk through an example, a real life example that we had at the University of Pittsburgh. And that was to evaluate the impact of something called the Pitt Success Pell Match program. And the Pitt Success Pell Match program was something we launched in 2019, and it was a very ambitious restructuring of our financial aid strategy at the university. And effectively, what this restructuring did is it matched Pell Grants at the university. So any student who received a Pell Grant from the federal government was getting matching funds from the University of Pittsburgh. Okay. And the question was, well, did it work? And so my question back was, well, what's the purpose? What are you trying? Why are we doing this? And so through conversations, it was clear that the purpose is that we wanted to make Pitt more affordable. And we wanted to improve academic outcomes. So that was the purpose. That's what we were trying to accomplish. That's what we thought the program objectives were. In terms of the people, we decided that we were going to look at the students who came in the first cohort of first-year students who would be eligible for the Pell matching funds. Okay. And that was our cohort. Now, if I were just wearing my researcher hat, I would say, ooh, let's give half the students the Pell match, and let's not give the other half of the students the Pell match. And that would be the best way to evaluate that. We can't do that. That would not be a fair thing to do. So we need to think about other ways to compare, other groups to compare to. And so what we opted to do was to compare our fall 2019 first-year cohort to the prior year cohort to say, did we see something different for the 2019 cohort than the 2018 cohort? Not ideal, but ethical. So that's what we did. And then as we thought about the outcomes, we aligned them with the purpose. So outcomes was the size of the loan that a student was taking out on an annual basis. How big were their loans? Ultimately, the real metric we cared about was how much debt did they have at graduation, but we were going to have to wait a really long time for that. So looking at loans every year was a way to do that. And then in terms of our academic outcomes to improve academic performance, we looked at things like GPA, at retention and persistence. And then ultimately we'll be looking at 4- and 6-year graduation rates, or the likelihood for students to graduate in 4 to 6 years. And we had this great plan in place. And then there was a global pandemic, which really impacted a lot of these metrics. So our ability to answer some of these questions has been a little bit limited because of that coming in and sort of throwing a wrench in our ability to compare the fall 2019 cohort to the fall 2018 cohort. But through some of our I'm not going to share the data here because this is more about process than the data, but we are seeing really great impacts on debt at graduation for our earliest cohorts who were part of the Pitt Success Pell Match program, as well as we saw some really great impacts on retention as well. We're still waiting on the likelihood of graduation at 4- and 6-year metrics, but overall we're looking very good. But we really had to think about and be concrete about how we were going to evaluate this. And I'm going to turn things over to April to talk about an example she wanted to share that's a little bit different in spirit, but still takes through the same idea.
Thanks, Amanda. So we had the Pitt Success Pell Match program, and while we were launching that, we were asking the same question that Tammy Kay asked, right? How are we supporting these students on our campus? So a bunch of us got together and said, what is the landscape at the University of Pittsburgh? So we wanted to evaluate the impact of programs currently at the university supporting our at-promise students. And we defined at-promise as first generation, limited income, and or underrepresented minority students on our campus. Next slide, Amanda. So that was the big question, like, trying to think about that. But, I worked really hard with Amanda on this, and she kept asking me, but what is the purpose? What is the purpose of this? Like, what do you want to find out? And so we came up with, basically the purpose was better understanding the landscape. We just kind of wanted to know basically what's happening here. What kind of data exactly, what kind of programs are here. And then I just explained exactly the population, undergraduate students, but also students serving in those existing programs, right? What are the programs too? So we kind of had to sleuth that out as well. Thank you, Weston. I appreciate that. Next slide. And so we were looking at different outcomes. Well, we worked with the program directors pretty specifically, but anyway, in working with the researchers and working with Amanda's team, we decided we needed the program lists. So we needed those kinds of things. We were looking at those student demographics that I looked at. We also wanted to know, are students retained? And we also wanted to know some things about academics. So I listed GPA there, but we also worked with the programs on other kinds of things that they were collecting on GPA. Now, I shared the website with you. We need to do another update on that website because we just redid this. And I'm talking a little further than process to Amanda. Apologies, because I figured people would ask about this. But if you go to the next slide, I'll just share 3 things really quickly about it if you wanted to. But we identified, what those programs are. We identified an opportunity to increase the participation. In other words, we weren't serving enough students in our at-promise population. But what we did find, which I'll say, because I know a lot of you also serve a lot of programs such as this, is that those students were being retained at a higher rate than other students, particularly at-promise students on our campus. So, participation in these programs matter. I just thought you'd like to know that. That's all I'm going to say.
Thanks, April. So what we want to do now is to have folks walk through a real life example that we thought might be of interest to this group, which is what's the impact of a belongingness intervention on first-year students? And to go through and think about what's the purpose, what's the population or people, and what are the outcomes that you might want to leverage. So walking through that particular example in some breakout. April, do you want to share your conversation or have someone from your group speak out?
Yeah, I'd love to. And please, anybody join. We talked a lot about how each individual campus is very specialized in what their belongingness intervention is going to look like, right? So I'll think of an example of Penn State World Campus, and their student population is going to depend on adult learners feeling that sense of belonging, right? And it's it's a virtual campus, right? So thinking about the needs of adult learners belonging to that institution, still wanting to feel like a Penn Stater and wanting to wear the gear and doing some things, right, is going to feel very different than perhaps, I think it was the University, Iowa, was it Iowa, right? Iowa, yeah, who talked about international students, right? So first year international students, that sense of belonging for their first year have very different needs, but still a very, very important group of students who need to feel that sense of belonging when they walk on that campus. Oh, those needs are so much different, but still very important. And so understanding that population, that second piece, Amanda, and then feeding into those outcomes, I think is so important. Who else? Anybody else want to share what we talked about? Please do. Did I get some things right? And I saw some old friends. I love it.
Does anyone have any questions or any kind of examples that you're thinking about on your campus that you'd like for us to chat about here? We do have a few minutes left before we need to close, and we're happy to use that time to benefit someone who has a project they're thinking about.
I guess I have a question for like metrics for measuring belongingness. I mean, on the one hand, I suppose, you know, you're looking at retention, but also would you be looking in satisfaction surveys or creating more targeted ones as a way to try to capture that?
Yeah, Amy, when we were doing a belongingness intervention on our campus, we did leverage some of that survey data. And there are some well-validated assessments of belonging that the researchers we were partnering with leveraged, and we were able to combine that survey data with some of our administrative data to look at things like grades in particular courses and ultimately retention to the university the next year. So I think you can think about combining these things, and for some of your concepts, it may be a survey is the right way to get at what your outcome and your metric is. Yeah.
Oops.
Great question.
So Tammy asked, you know, another similar question about belonging, and I was typing and I pressed the enter button instead of, so I'll just talk. So Tammy talked about belonging. It's a tough term. And she says what makes her 19-year-old feel like she belongs is very different from the person across the room. It's the perception of belonging, and it's different, and the definition is different from your own personal space. We've done a lot of work in this space with researchers who they spend all their time in researching what, you know, what belonging means and how to define it and how to help students, you know, figure that out on campus. What we found, and I can send some links to kind of look at some of the videos where we try to think through some of this stuff and what the interventions for us, you know, look like. What we found is it's about one thing is about sharing stories, right? And sharing stories specifically of struggle and helping students kind of feel safety in that space. So it's also about feeling safe in a space, and also just helping them. Not saying you belong. First of all, one of the I want to say worse, that might not be one of the things you shouldn't do is say you belong here, right? That almost makes it worse for students because they say, oh, I should. Oh, well, I don't, right? And so that's one thing that sometimes we feel like we do, and then so it's more of a feeling, like Tammy says, it's a feeling and a perception. So how do we make spaces and places for students? There's ways that we definitely can do that, but also it's just about being our own, in my humble opinion. But what we found is that, you know, it's about being our authentic selves, helping students and everybody else feel safe to do that, right? but helping students understand, wow, you know, I'm sharing my story because I didn't just plop here, right? How did I get here? Well, it took a lot. I took a struggle, and how can I help you understand that it also, college is hard. College is hard. College is difficult. And guess what? I'm going to help you through it. And that's what those programs that we kind of work through is kind of helping us get there too. I'll share a couple resources I have, but that's the down. That's a little bit of a 5-second, but we've done a lot of work in this space. And I think the researchers that we worked with can help a little, can do it better than April can.
Thanks, April. I think we're just about at
We are
time
just about.
here. Yeah, but thank you all so much for listening to the presentation. April and I are happy to talk with you offline. So if you have any questions, you can find us through the conference app. And, you know, I will plop our email addresses into the chat as well. So thank you all so much.